welcome. This is the first edition of the Deep Dive featured by Hudson Institute, and we are honored to have our first guest, Vice President Mike Pence. Thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's good to be with you and good to be back at the Hudson Institute.
Yes, sir. Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to initially talk about your recent trip together with your wife, Karen, to Israel. You traveled to the southern areas of Israel, where on October 7th, 1,200, mostly civilians, including 33 Americans, were brutally butchered, massacred. 4,800 others were wounded. 246 were kidnapped, including elderly men, women, children, infants. 12 of them U.S. citizens. 134 remain in Hamas captivity to date, 8 of them Americans, 3 of whom were murdered while in captivity. While visiting southern Israel, what went through your mind?
Well, Jonathan, I just had to go. And since my youth, I have, like most Americans from the heartland, I've cherished the Jewish state of Israel. During my years in Congress and as governor and as vice president, it was my great privilege to champion the relationship between the United States and Israel. You can literally look to the American founding and see the love the American people have had throughout our history for the people of Israel and for the hope and the dream that became a reality in 1948, that the Jewish people would be returned to their historic homeland. But I must tell you, when I was traveling in a presidential campaign of my own on October the 7th and heard the initial reports, I was horrified. My heart broke for the loss of life, for the brutality that was reported. But Jonathan, nothing could have prepared me for what we saw. We walked through the kibbutz Kfar Aza and spoke to families that lost loved ones, some of whom still had loved ones in captivity being held hostage. I heard about the assault from the perspective not just of the people who had endured it and survived, but also I learned as we toured Sderot that this was not simply a terrorist attack. This was a terrorist invasion. I mean, I honestly didn't know until we went, Jonathan, that there were more than 90 separate incursions along the fence line of Gaza simultaneously, with vehicles, heavily armed personnel in 3 different waves, and that they literally came into Israel with sufficient armaments, according to intelligence gathered afterwards, to march all the way to Tel Aviv, all the way to Jerusalem. That but for the heroism of law enforcement, IDF forces, and many courageous civilians who literally, ran to the sound of the guns on that day, Hamas may well have succeeded in cutting Israel in half. And to understand that, to see it firsthand, to walk through homes in that kibbutz that still had bullet-riddled walls and blood-stained furniture and floors, and to hear of the unspeakable brutality visited on men, women, and children, left me with the indelible conclusion that the United States must stand with Israel in this moment until they hunt down and destroy Hamas once and for all, and every hostage is restored to their families. We cannot falter. We cannot send an ambiguous signal. And I came back with no other view.
And yet, with that, currently the administration in Washington aims to find alternatives, as it put it, to Israel's conviction that it must enter into the border town of Rafah, where 4 Hamas battalions remain, where the hostages are believed to be currently with the Hamas leadership. What should Israel take out of that?
Israel must do what is necessary to secure their nation against an existential threat in Hamas and in Hezbollah and ultimately in Tehran. And that means Israel, whatever the current American administration is saying, it's clear. Israel must invade Rafah. They must take down Hamas. I mean, this business of now the United States even beginning to join a chorus of restraint worldwide. Look, I was in Washington, D.C. on September 11th. I watched the smoke rising from the Pentagon. I was a new member of Congress at the time. I was at Ground Zero a week later. A month after that, I visited the field in Pennsylvania, where Flight 93 came down. When we launched hostilities against al-Qaeda, when we took down the Taliban government, I don't remember any countries in the world speaking the language of restraint. When our armed forces under our administration were hunting down and destroying ISIS and ultimately taking down their leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, I don't remember voices of restraint because people understood the nature of the threat. And it just seems to me, and I say this as someone who considers Israel to be our most cherished ally, that especially in times like these, the people of Israel should know whatever the American administration is saying, whatever leaders in both political parties are saying, the American people stand with Israel. And Israel can be confident that the people of this country will stand with them until the fight is done.
And yet, a day after October 7th, the Iranian proxy, Hezbollah, started launching cross-border attacks against Israeli positions. The government in Jerusalem subsequently decided to relocate 61,000 Israelis 5 kilometers from the border. Mm-hmm. And another roughly 40,000 have also relocated out of their own volition for fear that what happened on October 7th in the south may recur on the northern front. You referred to September 11th. On 20th September was the famous State of the Union that followed. President George W. Bush spoke about a pledge to pursue terrorists, state actors that support terror until they no longer do so. And yet we see the Islamic Republic of Iran untouched, continuing to sow malign activities throughout the region, attacking not only Israel, but U.S. forces in the region, with 3 U.S. service members, unfortunately, losing their lives in Tower 22. What can U.S. leadership at this point in time push forward in order to reassure once again its allies and partners in the region that the United States is strong and it will not falter in the face of adversity?
Well, first, I have to say, having traveled to the northern border in January and broken bread with soldiers who were there at an artillery battery, Jonathan, I've rarely been as inspired when I heard one story after another of how these soldiers, 90% of whom were reservists, deployed on October the 7th to the northern border within 12 hours. And most of them didn't have orders. I mean, it was deeply inspiring to me. And I've heard tell about, for all of recent political controversies in Israel and people talking about whether they'll step up as reservists. There was something like 120% participation. I mean, to see the way the people of Israel responded, it should be deeply inspiring to everyone that cherishes Israel and everyone in this country. But look, to your larger point, the former Secretary of State and I penned an editorial in the Wall Street Journal in early February in the wake of the repeated attacks out of Yemen by the Houthis and the malign influence, and now we've lost American service members in the region. We said it's time to strike Iran, in Iran. It's time to make Iran feel the price of what they are inflicting through their surrogates, whether it's be Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, or other actors in the region. I welcome reports that Israel struck an armed depot outside Damascus that supplied Hezbollah from Iran. But ultimately, I think the time has come, perhaps it's overdue, that our various allies in the region join the United States in striking, whether it be energy infrastructure, whether it be military ships, but to literally make Iran feel the price. Our administration isolated Iran as never before, and literally the sanctions that were placed on Iran, the way we took down the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Qasem Soleimani, all sent a message that there would be a price that Iran would pay if they continue to sow their malign influence across the region. And they were contained more than at any time in recent memory. That all changed with the capitulation, with policy of appeasement with the Biden administration. And Iran only understands strength. And I think the time has come to show American strength and the strength of our Western allies in the region. I have no doubt Israel can take care of themselves in this fight, to the south and to the north. But ensuring that Iran knows if they continue to foment violence either against Israel or across the region, that they'll pay a price I think will be essential in the days ahead.
You referred to the Red Sea, and freedom of navigation obviously is a big part of world commerce. Looking at the broader picture though, China is procuring roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports, which ultimately fuels Tehran's capacity to support Russia by developing various munitions and drones among them, to be sold to Russia to be utilized in the war against Ukraine. To what degree is the age of strategic power competition a competition that the United States is ready to engage in?
America is the leader of the free world. If America is not leading the free world's not being led. Our administration understood that. We demanded more of our allies. And before
justifiably so.
Well, before we left office, NATO countries were contributing $120 billion more to our common defense. South Korea was contributing more. Japan was making a major investment in their own military. The West was stronger, even with the demands that we placed on our allies. The West was stronger, and I would submit to you what we're witnessing in the world today, with the rise of this new axis of evil between Russia and China and Iran and North Korea, proves the point that in global politics, just like in nature, nature abhors a vacuum. And there's been a receding of American leadership. The disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, I believe, created the conditions that emboldened Russia to move troops across the border in Ukraine. I have to believe that the appeasement toward Iran, it emboldened Tehran and its surrogates in the region to sow violence in the region and ultimately take the unspeakable acts that Hamas took on October the 7th. So the only antidote here is American strength. There's a clarity of American purpose. And the American people will be making our own choice in our elections this coming year. We'll be setting a course, not just choosing candidate, but also choosing a direction. And for my part, while I won't be a candidate in this election year, I'm going to continue to give voice to that vision because, frankly, I have a great concern that while the Democratic Party has been overrun by the politics of appeasement and even has become home to some of the most rank anti-Semitic rhetoric in the West, even among elected leaders in the Congress of the United States. Frankly, we have a rising tide of Republican isolationism. Republicans in the Congress and in many national voices in and outside the party that are talking about walking away from Ukraine and our support for their fight for their freedom. And there's also voices that are talking about questioning American support for Israel.
Is it truly broad within the Republican Party?
I don't believe it is, but it's loud.
Right.
Let's be clear. Some of the largest voices outside the party openly advocate for cutting funding not only to Ukraine, but cutting funding to Israel. And the Republican Party has a history a century ago of retreating toward isolationism. I'm someone who believes in peace through strength. I believe that to provide for the common defense is the first object of the federal government. We're the arsenal of democracy, and that America needs to exercise leadership on the world stage, and that the Republican Party has been the vanguard of that. And I'm going to continue to call leaders, and not only call out the Biden administration and Democrats for their politics of appeasement, and many of them who've openly ridiculed the Jewish state of Israel, but also I'm going to continue to call out that rising tide of Republican isolationism, because I really believe the American people understand that we are not only an inspiration to the free world, but that we have a responsibility to the free world to lead, to see to the freedom of navigation on the seven seas, to marshal the resources of the West to defend freedom and free markets. And for my part, whatever the future holds for me, we're going to be a voice for America leading the free world, and in no ways more important. As I like to say, if the world knows nothing else, the world should know this, that America stands with Israel.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Vice President, the last question, because I do believe that U.S. allies and partners, knowing that the United States has the capacity to contend with the challenges ahead, is deeply aspiring to see the leadership necessary to lead. And therefore, I'd like to know from your perspective, what are the next steps necessary to bring about that perception and translating that necessity of leadership also to the American people in a manner that will be palatable to them and that would drive once again the support that was seen after 9/11?
I think we have to remember, as the Bible teaches, that there's nothing new under the sun. What is now has been before. And the lessons of history have been hard-learned lessons. We learned in the 20th century that we can turn a blind eye to the widening threats to freedom around the world, but they'll eventually reach our shores. when there was a talk of isolationism and of keeping America out of wars. And then Pearl Harbor happened. History showed up on September the 11th for people that had hoped that the threat of terrorism was something that happened in the Middle East or in other places around the world, but never here. We learned a hard lesson, and it's one of the reasons why I think it'll be absolutely essential that we produce leadership in this country that communicates clearly and plainly with the American people. Not just about the threat, but about our unquestionable capacity to confront that threat. The United States is the greatest nation on earth. We have virtually unlimited capacity to defend our people and defend our interests around the world if we marshal the support and the will to do that. And I hope and I literally pray that in the days ahead we'll once again produce leadership that can articulate not only the threat that this new axis of evil presents, the threat to free nations around the world, including ours, but also that we can produce leadership that speaks with confidence about the ability of the United States of America to lead the free world to the peace and prosperity, and ultimately to create the conditions in which freedom-loving people in those very same countries may well have the opportunity someday to rise up and claim their own birthright of freedom.
Mr. Vice President Mike Pence, thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I'd like to thank all of you at home as well until our next edition from Deep Dive here at Hudson in Washington, D.C. Good evening.
For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.